This is my true story. I raised a son I believed would take care of me when my strength began to fade. I gave him everything, my savings, my trust, my name. I thought kindness would protect me from cruelty. But I was wrong. When I needed help the most, he took control of my life, cut me off from my medicine, and watched me struggle. What he didn't know was that I still had one thing he couldn't steal: my mind. I used it to take back my life and everything he thought was his. Before that, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And don't forget to subscribe so stories like mine never fade. He built his life from nothing but sweat, iron, and purpose. From the first day he held his newborn son, he made a silent promise that no matter how hard the years became, the boy would never know hunger, fear, or debt. He worked double shifts, carried heavy loads, and came home with torn palms that stung when he washed them. Every drop of effort was converted into food, books, and safety. He kept envelopes hidden behind old cupboards marked school fees, winter clothes, emergency. He refused to spend a single coin on himself if it meant the boy could learn, could dream, could grow. When his wife passed away too soon, he never complained. He just folded his grief into his work and kept going. His son became his entire reason to live. Years passed, and so did opportunities. The father never took vacations, never wasted time in comfort. His world was simple: earn, save, and give. Every sacrifice was a brick laid in the foundation of his son's future. He believed that if love was honest, it would come back in the same shape it was given. When the boy finished college, the father's chest swelled with pride. He wore his only good suit and sat in the back row of the graduation hall, clapping until his hands hurt. Tears filled his eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. He had done it. He had built a man out of his own hardship. In that moment, he believed that kindness guaranteed loyalty and blood promised respect. When his son found work and started earning, the father finally let himself rest a little. His knees ached, his vision blurred, but he felt peace knowing his efforts had created stability. The boy began taking over finances, paying bills, managing savings, setting up online accounts. The father didn't question it. Trust was natural, automatic. After all, it was his son. He started signing papers without reading the fine print. He handed over access to the joint accounts, thinking it would make life easier. He believed unity was strength. He believed his son's success was his own success. The years drifted by, and the father began to age faster than he expected. His health weakened, but his spirit remained generous. He didn't fear illness. He feared loneliness. He told himself that no child would ever abandon a parent who had given everything. He was wrong, but he didn't know it yet. As the medicines on his bedside table multiplied, so did his gratitude for his son's help. The young man managed the refills, scheduled doctor appointments, handled payments. The father often said, "You've made my life easier." And his son would smile. But the smile had changed. There was no warmth in it anymore, only routine. The old man didn't notice at first. Age made him slow, trusting made him blind. When small things started slipping, missed dosages, late deliveries, smaller bank withdrawals, he dismissed them as simple mistakes. He still believed his son was busy, tired, overworked. He refused to imagine betrayal growing inside his own home. When neighbors praised the son for being so responsible, the father smiled with pride. He didn't realize that the world saw only what his son wanted it to see: a caring child managing his old father's affairs. Behind closed doors, though, that same care had turned into quiet control. The father began noticing strange patterns. His pension arrived but disappeared faster than usual. The receipts didn't match the expenses. When he asked, his son laughed it off, saying, "You don't need to worry about these things anymore." And the old man didn't. He wanted to trust. He wanted peace. But trust without boundaries becomes permission. He remembered the day he signed the joint bank agreement. The banker had said politely, "Sir, this gives your son full access." "Are you sure?" He had smiled proudly and answered, "Of course. He's my only family." Those words would later haunt him like an echo that never fades. Time passed, and the father began feeling weaker. The medicines that once kept him steady ran out faster, and replacements didn't come on time. He brushed it off, perhaps delivery delays, perhaps oversight. Still, he never suspected malice. He believed that neglect came only from strangers, never from family. Each night he counted his pills before sleeping. Sometimes they were fewer than they should have been. Once he noticed one prescription bottle missing entirely. When he asked, the son replied vaguely about new schedules and doctor advice. The father didn't argue. Years of trusting had dulled his instinct for confrontation, but something deep inside began to stir. A quiet unease. He felt like a guest in his own life, as if permission had replaced respect. He couldn't shake the sense that his independence was slowly being erased, not by fate, but by the same hands he had once lifted to the sky in gratitude. One evening, as he sat by the window watching the light fade, he realized what had changed. He no longer had control over his own choices. His health, his money, even his medicine. Everything now depended on someone else's decision. He had built a world of care for his son, but in return, he had been made dependent on the very person who owed him gratitude. That night, he opened his old briefcase, the one that held decades of memories. Inside were bank statements, pension slips, and the legal documents that tied his life to his son's name. His hands trembled as he turned each page. Every signature felt like a confession of trust. Every line reminded him how deeply he had believed in loyalty. For the first time, he saw the pattern clearly. The power imbalance wasn't an accident, it was a design. And it had been built patiently, with the same care he once used to build his son's future. He sat there for hours, realizing how fragile love becomes when control replaces compassion. The truth sank slowly, painfully. The man he had raised with hope had turned his kindness into leverage. But beneath that heartbreak, another emotion stirred: resolve. He wasn't dead yet. His body may have weakened, but his mind was sharper than his son knew. The man who had built everything from scratch could still build again. This time, not for someone else, but for his own freedom. The house was silent that night. Only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock filled the air. The old man sat in his chair, staring at his reflection in the dark window. His face was wrinkled, but his eyes, those eyes that had seen both creation and collapse, still burned. He whispered a silent promise to himself. Not of revenge, but of balance. He had given too much. Now he would take back what was his. He would do it quietly, legally, intelligently. The same patience that once built a future for his son would now rebuild control for himself. And so began the journey, not of anger, but of awakening. It began slowly, almost too quietly to notice. At first, it looked like simple forgetfulness, a missed call from the pharmacy, a delayed refill, a skipped visit. But neglect, like rust, always starts small before it eats through everything. The father's medicines, once neatly arranged by his bedside, began to run low more often. The pharmacy used to send text updates, but those messages stopped arriving. When he mentioned it to his son, the response was always quick but dismissive. "I'll take care of it." Yet days passed, and nothing changed. Then came the excuses. "The system's down. The doctor's office is closed. You're using too many pills." Each explanation sounded thin, stretched, rehearsed. The old man didn't argue. He just nodded, as though agreeing could somehow keep the peace. But inside, doubt started to form like a crack in glass. He began checking his medicine cabinet at night. One evening, he found empty bottles that should have lasted another week. He thought maybe he had miscounted. Maybe age had started playing tricks on his mind. But then he noticed the receipts. Missing dates, wrong dosages, smaller quantities than before. Someone was tampering with more than his medication. They were tampering with his dignity. The body depends on medicine, but the soul depends on respect. Both were being taken from him. His health began to shift subtly. His hands trembled longer in the mornings. His breath shortened on the stairs. Meals tasted dull, and fatigue pressed heavy behind his eyes. He told his son he needed to see the doctor again, but the young man brushed it off. "You're fine. It's just age." That word, age, became an excuse for everything. It justified every delay, every oversight, every wound hidden behind a smile. The father realized that his illness was not just physical, it was emotional neglect, disguised as care. The visits grew fewer. Sometimes his son didn't even come home. He'd leave instructions scribbled on paper, telling the old man to rest more and take it easy. But the old man didn't need rest. He needed presence. He needed someone to listen, to notice, to care. When the house fell silent, he found himself talking to old photographs, to the empty chair where his son used to sit. The television played for company. Meals turned into rituals of solitude. Days blurred into nights, each one colder than the last. The first time he tried to refill his prescription himself, the pharmacist looked confused. "Sir, your account's been deactivated. Your card was blocked by your family." He froze. Family. The word felt heavy, almost mocking. He thanked the pharmacist, stepped outside, and stood on the street for a long time, the paper bag empty in his hand. The wind felt sharp, cutting through the thin layers of trust he'd wrapped around his son. He walked home slowly, every step heavy with disbelief. At the door, he paused, realizing that his house no longer felt like his own. The walls, once symbols of safety, now echoed with quiet betrayal. That night, as he tried to sleep, he stared at the ceiling and listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator. It was the only sound left in the house. The sound of something still functioning when everything else had stopped. He didn't tell anyone, not the neighbors, not the doctor, not even the priest who visited once a week. Pride kept him silent. A lifetime of providing had taught him that asking for help was a kind of defeat. But as the days went on, silence began to suffocate him. His body weakened, but his mind sharpened in ways it hadn't before. He started paying attention, really paying attention. He tracked every missing dollar, every unopened envelope, every delayed purchase. The pieces began to connect, forming a picture too cruel to ignore. His son wasn't just neglecting him, he was deliberately controlling him. The canceled prescriptions, the blocked cards, the missing funds, they weren't accidents, they were choices. Calculated, intentional, and cruel. He wanted to believe there was still love underneath it all, that maybe his son was stressed, overwhelmed, or simply misguided. But then came the moment that erased all doubt. He overheard a conversation. Through the thin walls of the living room, he heard his son on the phone, laughing. "He doesn't even know what's going on. I've locked everything down. It's better this way." Those words didn't just sting, they broke something permanent inside him. The voice that once cried as a child was now the same voice plotting against him. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just sat in the dark, feeling the weight of the years between them collapse into dust. That was the night he stopped thinking of himself as a father. That was the night he became a man planning his freedom. He understood something essential. Dependency gives birth to power, and power, in the wrong hands, destroys compassion. His son had stopped seeing him as a parent and started seeing him as property. The next morning, the son walked in cheerfully, pretending nothing had happened. He spoke of bills and errands and said the doctor's visit could wait another month. The father nodded politely, but his mind was elsewhere. He realized then that quiet people are often the most dangerous, because silence doesn't mean defeat, it means preparation. He began to document everything, the canceled accounts, the blocked card statements, the medical reports showing missed dosages. Every piece of paper became a small weapon of truth. He didn't plan revenge out of anger, he planned it out of necessity, to survive. It's strange how betrayal can awaken something sharp in even the frailest hearts. The body may age, but the will, when pushed to its limit, becomes diamond hard. He spent nights sitting at the kitchen table, his lamp burning low, his mind running steady. He wasn't just an old man anymore, he was a strategist, a survivor in disguise. Each time his son left the house, he opened the cabinet, checked his pills, and whispered a promise. "You'll never control me again." He started preparing, not with fists or fury, but with documents and decisions. The tools of the same world his son thought he understood. And as the plan formed, he smiled faintly for the first time in months, not out of joy, but out of power returning quietly to his hands. Morning came with the usual silence that now filled the house. The sunlight crept in through thin curtains, cutting lines of gold across the floorboards. The father sat in his chair, frail but composed, waiting for his son to bring the morning medicine. It used to be a gesture of care once, a quiet ritual between them, but that morning the sound of footsteps felt heavier, impatient, unkind. He heard the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the quick shuffling of papers, and then his son's voice, not warm, not patient, but sharp, like someone handling a burden he didn't want to carry. The old man waited, holding his glass of water. Minutes passed. Then the truth arrived, not as silence, but as cruelty. When the son entered, his hands were empty. No medicine bottle, no gentle reminder, only anger behind tired eyes. He said words that cut deeper than pain ever could. The father's request had been simple. He had asked for his refills. But what came in return was accusation, not compassion. The son snapped that old men used too much, that they were draining the family's money, that the pills weren't even necessary. It wasn't just neglect now, it was punishment disguised as logic. The father tried to explain, weakly, that the medication wasn't luxury, it was survival. But before he could finish, the son slammed the drawer shut, turning his back as if the sight of weakness offended him. That sound, wood against wood, echoed through the small room like thunder. The old man sat still, his breath caught between shock and disbelief. For a moment, he thought it was a nightmare, something that would fade if he blinked long enough. But the truth was, standing right there in the room, his own child, a man raised by his hands, had just decided he didn't deserve care anymore. The day dragged on like a cruel play that wouldn't end. The father felt every hour heavier than the one before. His stomach tightened, his heart skipped irregular beats. He reached for his last few pills, swallowing them dry, counting how many hours until they ran out completely. His mind began to drift, not from illness, but from exhaustion, the kind that settles deep when love turns cold. In the afternoon, he checked the cabinet. Empty. The shelf where his medication once sat now looked like a graveyard, hollow, forgotten. The pharmacy number was scrawled on the wall calendar, but when he dialed, the line disconnected. His card had been canceled. He couldn't even buy what he needed to live. The betrayal was complete now, not loud, but final. There was no shouting match, no thrown dishes, no slammed doors, just quiet control. The son had taken not only his father's money, but his autonomy, the right to live and decide for himself. Evening came. The father sat in his chair, eyes on the clock, body shaking lightly. The minutes passed, like echoes in a church, hollow, infinite. He realized that death wouldn't frighten him anymore. What frightened him was dying with shame. When the son finally walked past him, dressed to go out, the father looked up briefly. The younger man didn't stop, didn't look, just grabbed his keys and left. The sound of the door closing felt like a lock sealing forever. The house fell silent again, but this time it wasn't grief sitting beside him, it was resolve. He had survived wars, storms, hunger. He had built everything from dirt with his bare hands, and now, a man who hadn't lifted a finger to earn his own comfort had decided when his father would breathe and when he wouldn't. He thought of the years he'd spent teaching that same boy about honesty, kindness, and gratitude. How he'd worked through sickness just to keep food on the table. How he'd skipped his own medicine when the boy was young so the child could eat better. Now, decades later, the roles had reversed, except without mercy. But pity never fixed betrayal. Logic never healed cruelty. He realized that night that his illness wasn't the one the doctor had described. It wasn't a heart condition or a problem of aging. It was something deeper, a spiritual sickness brought on by misplaced trust. He knew now that what needed healing wasn't his body, it was his will. The following morning, he woke with a decision as strong as the first day he'd started working for his family. He moved slowly, conserving what little strength he had left, and reached for his small box of documents. Inside were papers, deeds, bank accounts, insurance details, the silent architecture of a lifetime of discipline. His son thought the control was absolute, but the father knew the truth. His name still stood first on every document. That meant power still existed, not in muscles, but in ink, not in shouting, but in signatures. He looked at his reflection in the window, the morning light outlining the wrinkles on his face. His skin sagged, his shoulders drooped, but his eyes, they were steady, alive. The same eyes that once looked at newborn innocence now stared at betrayal with clarity. That day, he made his plan. It wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be cruel, it would be quiet, legal, deliberate, the kind of justice that leaves no room for excuses. He picked up the phone and called his lawyer. His voice was soft but firm. He gave instructions slowly, carefully. There would be no revenge, no emotion, just procedure. By the time he hung up, the sun was high and bright, spilling warmth across the cold floor. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel powerless. He felt awake. That night, he slept deeply. The pain was still there, the body still weak, but something inside him had shifted. A calmness had replaced the helplessness. Because when a man realizes he has nothing left to lose, he becomes untouchable. The cruelty had shown him what love could not, that peace sometimes begins where forgiveness ends. He no longer pitied himself. He no longer pitied his son. He pitied the world that taught people that control is the same as care. He would show him the difference, and when the day came, he wouldn't raise his voice. He wouldn't lift a hand. He would simply sign a few papers and let the system he built protect him from the child he raised. The same law that once protected the son's education would now protect the father's dignity. It was poetic justice, clean, quiet, undeniable. He looked at the small clock beside his bed. The second hand ticked forward steadily, unbothered by emotion. It reminded him that time always moves, no matter who tries to stop it. He closed his eyes and whispered one last promise to himself, not of hate, but of balance. He took away my care, he thought, but I will take back my control. And with that thought, the night ended, and the new life, the one built not on trust, but on wisdom, began. That night was long and heavy, the kind of night that stretches endlessly, where every minute feels like an hour and every thought feels like a storm. The father lay in bed, weak from both illness and disappointment, staring at the ceiling where shadows moved like memories. The house around him was quiet, too quiet, not peaceful, but hollow. Silence had replaced warmth. The air that once carried laughter now felt stale, like a space that had forgotten how to love. He thought about his younger days, about the years when his home was full of noise. The sounds of a child running through hallways, the faint smell of his wife's cooking, the peace that came from knowing his sacrifices meant something. Back then, exhaustion had a purpose. Every ache in his back was a sign that he was building a future for someone he loved. Every sleepless night meant his son could sleep safely. That memory now hurt more than any illness, because the future he built had become the prison he lived in. He tried to recall the moment things had changed. The day respect had turned into duty, and duty had turned into resentment. But there was no clear memory, no sudden fight or harsh word. It was a slow fade, like a sunset that becomes darkness before you even realize it's gone. One act of neglect led to another, until the line between love and control disappeared completely. The father had taught his son everything except gratitude. As the clock ticked softly in the dark, he realized something simple. Cruelty doesn't always scream. Sometimes it speaks in silence. Sometimes it hides behind polite smiles and practical excuses. You don't need that much medicine. You should rest more. You're spending too much. These weren't just words of concern. They were tools of control, disguised as care. And he had believed them because love had made him blind. He sat up slowly, the room spinning a little as his head grew light. The air was cold against his skin. He looked toward the table where his medication used to sit. The space was empty now, only dust and the faint mark of where the bottles once stood. The emptiness wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. That gap on the table was the same as the one that had opened in his heart. Something vital had been taken away, not by strangers, but by blood. He whispered no prayer that night. He didn't ask for healing or strength. Instead, he asked himself one question: how long could love survive humiliation? He had always believed love forgave everything. But this was not something love could fix. This was a lesson written in pain, a test of dignity. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like slow breathing. The world still went on, indifferent, steady. The thought gave him a strange kind of comfort. The cruelty of one man, even his own son, couldn't stop the sun from rising tomorrow. Life went on, and that meant he could too. He took a deep breath, the kind that comes from somewhere far deeper than the lungs, the kind that feels like a decision. That night, he made a silent promise. He would never beg again. Not for food, not for care, not even for love. Because love that requires begging isn't love. It's control wearing a kind face. He turned his gaze to the drawer beside the bed, where old letters still slept. Letters from his wife, yellowed with time, soft at the edges. He opened one, the ink slightly faded, the handwriting delicate. It spoke of hope, of partnership, of dreams they once shared. Reading it, he remembered her voice, the way she used to call him strong, even when he doubted himself. She had always told him, "You're a builder." Not just of houses or farms, but of futures. He closed the letter and smiled faintly. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to build again, not for his son, but for himself. To rebuild the parts of his soul that cruelty had tried to tear down. To build a life where peace didn't depend on anyone's permission. Hours passed, but sleep never came. His body ached, his heart even more. Yet his mind stayed sharp, awake in ways it hadn't been in years. The pain had burned away all illusions. What remained was clarity. He realized something profound that night. People often mistake weakness for kindness. They see patience as surrender and silence as fear. His son had seen all three. But what he didn't know was that silence can also be strategy. That patience, when born from intelligence, becomes power. The father knew he could no longer fix the past. He couldn't return the years he'd given, or change the man his son had become. But he could decide how the story would end. He could choose whether his last chapter was one of despair or of dignity. He sat by the window as dawn began to break. The first light of morning stretched across the sky, soft and orange. Birds began to stir, singing quietly into the cold air. The world was moving again, and so would he. He stood up slowly, holding onto the wall for balance. His legs trembled, but his heart didn't. Every movement felt deliberate, heavy with purpose. He wasn't just walking to the kitchen, he was walking back into control. Each step reminded him that he still owned his name, his choices, and his will. He boiled water for tea. The kettle whistled, a sound he hadn't heard in days. It felt alive, ordinary, grounding. He poured the tea and sat at the table, his hands steady around the cup. The warmth of the cup against his skin felt like a small act of rebellion, proof that he could still provide for himself. He thought about calling his son that morning, maybe to say he forgave him, maybe to pretend nothing had happened. But forgiveness, he realized, is not a gift you give to someone who hasn't asked for it. Forgiveness is for the free, not for the foolish. He took another sip of tea and looked toward the empty cabinet. "You took my medicine," he thought, "but you forgot. I'm the one who taught you how to live." And that realization changed everything, because in that moment, he stopped seeing himself as a victim. He began to see himself as a man who had simply been underestimated, the kind of man who could still rebuild quietly, patiently, and perfectly. The morning sun now filled the kitchen, touching the corners where shadows had once lived. The light felt warmer, fuller, more personal. He reached for his small notepad and began to write a list. It wasn't a grocery list or a to-do list. It was a list of reminders, truths he'd forgotten in the noise of cruelty. 1. My life is still mine. 2. My peace is my choice. 3. My son's actions don't define my worth. 4. Dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered. 5. Silence is not weakness, it's wisdom waiting. He read it 3 times, folded it, and slipped it into his pocket, a talisman of strength disguised as paper. Then he picked up the phone. Not to call his son, not to ask for help, but to call the one person who could help him regain control, his lawyer. That call wasn't made in anger. It was made in quiet certainty. He wasn't plotting revenge. He was reclaiming his right to live without permission, to decide once again what was his and what wasn't. When he hung up, a deep calm settled over him. Not joy, not pride, just peace, the kind that comes when a long war finally ends. He walked back to his chair, the sunlight now pouring in stronger. The world outside was alive again, and so was he. He didn't look back at the past. He didn't think of his son's cruelty. He simply sat, breathed, and existed, freely, fully, quietly. And for the first time in months, the silence in his house wasn't painful. It was powerful. Morning came quietly, with sunlight slipping through the curtains like a secret. The father woke before the birds began to sing, the air still and pale. Something inside him felt calm, stiller than usual, like the moment before a storm, when everything is waiting to shift. Today, the silence didn't belong to pain anymore. It belonged to him. He sat at the edge of his bed, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of his decisions settle in his bones. The world outside carried on, cars moving, children shouting, distant noises blending into the rhythm of another ordinary day. But this wasn't an ordinary day. It was the day balance returned, the day the quiet became louder than cruelty. He made tea again, as always. His hands didn't shake this time. Each small action, boiling the water, stirring the cup, folding the napkin, was filled with purpose. He didn't rush. Power didn't need to move fast. It only needed to move right. He walked to his desk and opened the drawer. Inside lay a folder of documents neatly arranged, the bank authorizations, the transfer receipts, the new account numbers, and the signed legal papers that gave him full control once again. The papers looked ordinary, thin, almost fragile, yet they were stronger than any weapon. They were truth in ink form. While the city outside stretched and yawned awake, somewhere across town, his son was likely still asleep, dreaming of the comfort he believed would last forever. The father knew that soon the phone would ring and panic would echo from the other side. He didn't wish for suffering. He wished for understanding, a lesson written in reality, not in rage. By late morning, the chain reaction began. The son woke and tried to order food online, only for his payment to fail. He frowned, thinking it was a system issue. Then he tried again, another decline. His phone buzzed with alerts. Transaction denied. Insufficient access. He checked his banking app, expecting a glitch, but instead found words that tightened his chest. Account locked. Ownership updated. Contact your administrator. Across the room, his credit card sat in a wallet that suddenly meant nothing. He grabbed his phone again and called the bank, frustration rising, the way he once shouted at his father. But this time, there was no helpless old man on the other end, only a calm voice at the bank explaining that all authority had been legally reassigned to the account holder. The son froze, his throat went dry. He was the dependent now. The man he had starved, humiliated, and controlled had taken everything back, quietly, perfectly, legally. The father's phone rang soon after. He didn't answer. He let it ring, each vibration against the table like a soft reminder of justice returning home. He continued eating his breakfast, slow bites, steady breathing, peace filling the space that used to belong to pain. He knew the sun would come. Pride wouldn't allow him to stay silent for long. By noon, there was a loud knock at the door. The sound echoed through the house, sharp and desperate. The father didn't rush. He stood, placed his cup in the sink, and walked slowly to the door. When he opened it, he saw his son standing there, disheveled, panicked, and trembling. The arrogance that once filled his eyes had vanished. The father didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence was enough to make the younger man stumble over his own words. The son's hand shook as he held out his phone, showing screen after screen of frozen accounts, closed transfers, denied transactions. He stammered, his voice cracking, searching for words, excuses, explanations, anything. But words are useless when truth stands before you, calm and unshakable. The father looked at him with quiet pity, not hatred. The kind of pity that hurts more than anger ever could. The son's eyes filled with panic, his breath uneven. The man who once decided when his father could eat or take medicine now couldn't even buy his own lunch. That was the power of reversal. Not revenge, but reflection. Life had simply handed him a mirror. The father turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open behind him. He didn't invite his son in, but he didn't close him out either. He let him stand there, caught between shame and realization. The silence that filled the house wasn't the silence of control anymore. It was the silence of consequence. The father sat back down in his chair. He looked out the window while the son stood in the doorway, motionless. For the first time, the younger man understood how quiet can be louder than shouting. Eventually, the son's voice broke the still air, shaky, uncertain. But the father didn't turn around. He didn't need to explain. The truth was already written in every locked account, every frozen balance, every empty card. The younger man left after a while, defeated. His footsteps faded down the path, slower than before. The father stayed still, letting peace settle like sunlight on his shoulders. He had not won. There were no winners here, only lessons. But for the first time in years, he wasn't the one suffering. That evening, the father's lawyer called to confirm that all transitions had been successful. Every detail was clean, legal, and irreversible. The funds now sat safely under the father's private account, protected by new security layers. His will was also updated, with clear conditions, removing any future claim by the son unless responsibility and care were proven, not just claimed. The father thanked him softly and hung up. He went to the window again. The world outside glowed orange as the sun began to set. He watched people walking home, parents holding children's hands, couples talking quietly, strangers carrying groceries. Everyone was busy living, not knowing that somewhere in a small, quiet house, a man had just taken back his life. He sat by the window until the light faded. His body still ached, his hands still trembled sometimes, but inside, something had healed that medicine never could: dignity. Before bed, he opened his small notebook again, the same one where he had written his promises to himself. He turned to a blank page and wrote, "Today, I became my own guardian again. No one decides my worth. No one controls my breath. The world belongs to those who stay patient long enough to reclaim it." He closed the notebook and placed it beside the candle. Then he smiled, a tired, quiet smile that only those who have walked through humiliation understand. He didn't want his son to starve. He didn't want to see him punished beyond reason. What he wanted, and what he achieved, was understanding. By morning, the son would realize the full picture, not just the frozen accounts, but the moral one too. He would see that trust, once broken, cannot be reclaimed with tears. Only with time, only with proof. The father slept deeply that night. No nightmares, no fear, only calm. And in that calm, the universe seemed to whisper back, "Balance has returned." The morning came heavy with silence. The father could feel it in the air, that strange quiet that exists before someone comes to face their truth. He had lived long enough to know that silence wasn't always peace. Sometimes it was the space between two storms. He had finished his breakfast early and sat by the window, the same place he'd found calm so many times before. Outside, the day looked ordinary. Sunlight spread across the road, children ran to school, and somewhere a vendor shouted prices for fruit. Yet inside his house, everything felt different. Every second carried the weight of something approaching, something inevitable. The first knock came soft, the kind of knock that pretends to be polite but hides desperation beneath. The father didn't move. He waited. Another knock followed, harder this time. Then another, until the sound grew impatient, almost pleading. He stood slowly, his knees aching but steady. When he opened the door, his son stood there, pale, nervous, and smaller than the man he remembered. Gone was the arrogance, the sharpness, the casual cruelty. In its place stood someone hollowed by consequence. The father looked at him, not with hatred, but with quiet assessment. His eyes, calm and unreadable, seemed to hold up a mirror that the son couldn't bear to face. The younger man began to speak, but his voice trembled. The words stumbled over each other, excuses wrapped in confusion, fear dressed as explanation. But none of it mattered. The father didn't respond. He simply stood still, watching him unravel. Finally, when the son's breath broke into silence, the father turned and walked inside, leaving the door open. He didn't invite him in. He didn't tell him to leave. The decision, like everything else now, was up to the son. The younger man stepped inside hesitantly. The air in the room was clean, still, and cold, like a church without prayer. He noticed the table neatly arranged, the papers stacked in a folder, the candle by the window half burned. Everything looked in order, too in order. The son tried again, his tone shifting from panic to pleading. He spoke about mistakes, about misunderstanding, about fixing things. But the father knew that some things, once broken, could not be repaired. Not trust, not dignity, not love, traded for control. He sat down slowly, his back straight, his eyes on the window. Then, without raising his voice, he said the few words that needed to be said, quiet, factual, final. He didn't shout. He didn't explain. He didn't repeat himself. Because truth doesn't need volume. It just needs certainty. The son's face fell as reality sank in. The accounts, the property, the funds, all now locked under his father's name. Every number that once obeyed him now served silence. Every transaction that once built his arrogance now confirmed his fall. He stared at his father, waiting for some mercy, some flicker of emotion. But the old man's face stayed calm, unreadable, like stone shaped by years of wind. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft ticking of the wall clock, a reminder that time moves forward no matter how much you wish it didn't. The father reached for his glass of water, took a slow sip, and placed it back down with precision. The movement was deliberate, controlled, the gesture of someone who owned his space completely again. The son broke down. The words that followed weren't excuses anymore. They were regret, raw and trembling. He talked about stress, about pressure, about wanting to help but losing his way. He cried, not the kind of tears that clean the heart, but the kind that come too late to matter. The father listened without interruption. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look disappointed. He looked tired. The kind of tired that goes beyond sleep, the exhaustion of carrying pain for too long. He let the younger man speak until the room emptied of words. When silence returned, it felt heavier than before. Then the father said something, not cruel, not soft, just true. He told him that care is not a transaction, that love cannot live where control begins, that the bond between blood is not written in DNA, but in respect. Every word fell like stone, not shouted, not dramatic, but solid. Words that could not be argued with because they were born of experience, not ego. The son lowered his head, unable to meet his father's eyes. For the first time in his life, he understood what true power looked like. Not a raised hand, not a loud threat, but calm certainty. The father stood, walked to the desk, and handed him a small envelope. Inside were papers, proof that everything done had been legal, ethical, final. Attached to it was a single line, written in clean handwriting. You taught me how to survive. I taught you how it feels to be powerless. The son's breath caught. His hands trembled as he held the envelope. He wanted to speak again, to ask for forgiveness, but the words refused to come. Because forgiveness isn't given on demand. It is earned through time, through change, through humility. He turned to leave, his shoulders heavy, his pride gone. The door closed softly behind him. The father sat down again, looking at the empty doorway. For a long time, he didn't move. The room felt bigger somehow, cleaner, lighter. There was no joy in what had happened, only balance. He didn't want victory. He wanted peace. And now, at last, peace had returned, even if it came dressed as silence. That night, the father stepped outside. The air was cool, the sky clear. Stars scattered like small truths across the darkness. He stood there for a while, breathing slowly, feeling the quiet world turn around him. He realized something simple. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to his son, not to anyone. The lesson had been delivered, not with anger, but with consequence. When he went back inside, he looked at the chair where his son had sat earlier. For a moment, he almost felt pity again. But he stopped himself. Pity was what had kept him silent before, and silence had nearly destroyed him. He turned off the lights, leaving only the candle burning by the window. Its flame flickered gently, reflecting in the glass. Small, steady, alive. He whispered nothing, thought nothing. He just watched the flame dance, feeling peace in its quiet defiance. He understood then that revenge was never the point. It was never about taking back money or pride. It was about taking back his freedom, the right to live with dignity on his own terms. That night, the old man slept with no fear in his heart. And for the first time in a long time, the silence around him didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like power finally coming home. The days that followed felt strange. The house was quiet, but the silence no longer carried fear. It carried freedom. For years, that same silence had been heavy, filled with unspoken words and small humiliations. Now it felt light, like a wound finally closed. Outside, life went on as it always does. People walked to work, buses passed, the world kept turning. But inside the son's world, everything had stopped. The father knew this without needing to see it. He had lived long enough to know that when people build their lives on arrogance, even small cracks can make everything fall apart. And what he had done was not small. It was the quiet removal of a foundation. The first ripple came from the bank. The son tried to reopen his access, but every path was closed. The names on the files were changed, the security questions reset, the authorizations gone. He tried calling, shouting, pleading, but rules don't bend for emotion. Paperwork doesn't care about pride. Then came the second blow. His friends, the ones who had once laughed with him, borrowed money, called him generous, began to vanish. Without the easy money flowing from the accounts, without the show of wealth, the circle dissolved like smoke. People stopped answering his calls, pretending to be busy, keeping distance from his failure. At first, he blamed the banks, the system, bad luck, but deep down, he knew. Every locked account was a reminder of the man he had tried to control. Every letter from the lawyer was a reflection of his own cruelty written back in law and ink. Meanwhile, the father lived quietly. He woke early, cleaned the small house, made his meals, and sat by the window each afternoon. Peace felt foreign at first, a space so wide he didn't know how to fill it. But with each passing day, it became familiar. His body was still fragile, but his mind was light, his heart no longer waiting for kindness that never came. News of the son's downfall traveled through neighbors like whispers in the wind. Some were shocked, some weren't. People remembered the way the son spoke to his father, sharp, dismissive, loud. And now, those same voices spoke of karma, of justice, of lessons that come late but come strong. The father didn't gloat. He didn't smile when people told him what had happened. He simply nodded and changed the subject. Revenge wasn't joy. It was peace through balance. One evening, a letter arrived, handwritten, shaky, desperate. It was from the son. Inside were words of apology, confusion, and regret. He wrote about sleepless nights, unpaid bills, and the loneliness of losing everything. He begged for forgiveness, not money. The father read it slowly, line by line. When he finished, he folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. Not out of cruelty, but because forgiveness was a feeling, not a word you hand out. And he wasn't ready yet. That night, he went for a walk under the streetlights. The air was cool, the roads empty. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking to escape pain. He was walking simply because he could. Every step felt like a victory no one could see. Back home, he looked around the small living room, the books, the old chair, the photographs of a family that once felt whole. He didn't remove the pictures. He didn't tear them down in anger. He left them where they were because memory wasn't the enemy. It was proof that he had loved. Weeks passed. The son's name began to fade from local gossip. People moved on. But for the son, each day was heavier than the last. He had lost not just money, but the comfort of superiority. He had to work now. Real work, not the kind that came easy through inherited access. He began to taste humility in every meal. Sometimes neighbors mentioned that he had taken a small job far from the city. The father didn't ask where. He didn't need to. Life had already delivered its lessons in full. The lawyer called once more to confirm that everything remained secure: the accounts, the property, the trust. The father thanked him politely, then donated a small portion of his savings to a local clinic that provided medicine to the elderly. It felt right. He had once been denied health for the sake of control. Now, his freedom was saving others. Each night he slept soundly. No fear, no noise, just quiet satisfaction. There were moments, of course, when sadness came, when he remembered the small boy who once held his hand, the laughter of a simpler time. The innocence before greed had entered their lives. But he learned not to run from that sadness. It was part of healing. Pain, he realized, doesn't disappear. It transforms into wisdom if you let it. One afternoon, while watering his small garden, he looked at the sky and thought about how life moves in circles. What you give returns, what you take unfairly is taken back. That was nature's law, older than any written rule. And maybe, he thought, the son would learn too. Maybe one day he would grow from this, understand that love isn't something you control, but something you protect. The father didn't wish for his son's ruin anymore. He wished for his awakening. Months passed quietly. The seasons changed. Flowers bloomed and withered. Rain washed the streets clean, and life carried on. One morning, while reading the newspaper, he came across an article about financial abuse of the elderly. He read it slowly, his hand resting on the table, eyes steady. The article spoke of people who lost everything to their own families, left helpless by betrayal. He folded the paper and smiled faintly. He had been one of them once, but not anymore. His phone rang again that afternoon. This time, it wasn't the lawyer or the bank. It was a number he didn't recognize. When he answered, a voice on the other end spoke softly. It was his son. There was no arrogance in that voice anymore, only exhaustion and a kind of broken calm. He said he was doing better, that he had learned his lesson, that he was working and rebuilding slowly. He didn't ask for money. He only said, "I hope you're doing well." The father said nothing for a moment. Then he replied simply, "I am." And that was enough. When the call ended, the old man sat in his chair for a long time. His eyes didn't tear up. His heart didn't harden. He just sat quietly, feeling something new. Not forgiveness, not regret, but closure. The next morning, he donated more money to the clinic. He told them it was in the name of patience. They smiled and didn't ask questions. By now, his health had improved. His mind was sharper, his days peaceful. The loneliness that once scared him had turned into solitude, gentle, kind, and earned. He spent his evenings watching the sun fall beyond the trees. Every sunset reminded him that endings are not punishments. They are promises, proof that darkness comes only to make room for new light. He didn't see his son again, but he didn't need to. The story had already written itself. The chapter was closed. And though the world would never know what happened behind those quiet walls, the betrayal, the control, the reversal, he didn't need anyone to know. Truth, he realized, doesn't need witnesses. It only needs peace. That night, as he closed his notebook for the last time, he wrote one final line at the bottom of the page. He took away my medicine and thought I would die, but I lived long enough to teach him that life is a mirror. It always reflects back what you show it. Then he blew out the candle, and the room fell dark. But it was not the darkness of sorrow. It was the darkness of completion. The days that followed felt strange. The house was quiet, but the silence no longer carried fear. It carried freedom. For years, that same silence had been heavy, filled with unspoken words and small humiliations. Now it felt light, like a wound finally closed. Outside, life went on as it always does. People walked to work, buses passed, the world kept turning. But inside the son's world, everything had stopped. The father knew this without needing to see it. He had lived long enough to know that when people build their lives on arrogance, even small cracks can make everything fall apart. And what he had done was not small. It was the quiet removal of a foundation. The first ripple came from the bank. The son tried to reopen his access, but every path was closed. The names on the files were changed, the security questions reset, the authorizations gone. He tried calling, shouting, pleading, but rules don't bend for emotion. Paperwork doesn't care about pride. Then came the second blow. His friends, the ones who had once laughed with him, borrowed money, called him generous, began to vanish. Without the easy money flowing from the accounts, without the show of wealth, the circle dissolved like smoke. People stopped answering his calls, pretending to be busy, keeping distance from his failure. At first, he blamed the banks, the system, bad luck. But deep down, he knew. Every locked account was a reminder of the man he had tried to control. Every letter from the lawyer was a reflection of his own cruelty, written back in law and ink. Meanwhile, the father lived quietly. He woke early, cleaned the small house, made his meals, and sat by the window each afternoon. Peace felt foreign at first, a space so wide he didn't know how to fill it. But with each passing day, it became familiar. His body was still fragile, but his mind was light, his heart no longer waiting for kindness that never came. News of the son's downfall traveled through neighbors like whispers in the wind. Some were shocked, some weren't. People remembered the way the son spoke to his father, sharp, dismissive, loud. And now, those same voices spoke of karma, of justice, of lessons that come late but come strong. The father didn't gloat. He didn't smile when people told him what had happened. He simply nodded and changed the subject. Revenge wasn't joy. It was peace through balance. One evening, a letter arrived, handwritten, shaky, desperate. It was from the son. Inside were words of apology, confusion, and regret. He wrote about sleepless nights, unpaid bills, and the loneliness of losing everything. He begged for forgiveness, not money. The father read it slowly, line by line. When he finished, he folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. Not out of cruelty, but because forgiveness was a feeling, not a word you hand out. And he wasn't ready yet. That night, he went for a walk under the streetlights. The air was cool, the roads empty. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking to escape pain. He was walking simply because he could. Every step felt like a victory no one could see. Back home, he looked around the small living room, the books, the old chair, the photographs of a family that once felt whole. He didn't remove the pictures. He didn't tear them down in anger. He left them where they were because memory wasn't the enemy. It was proof that he had loved. Weeks passed. The son's name began to fade from local gossip. People moved on. But for the son, each day was heavier than the last. He had lost not just money, but the comfort of superiority. He had to work now, real work, not the kind that came easy through inherited access. He began to taste humility in every meal. Sometimes neighbors mentioned that he had taken a small job far from the city. The father didn't ask where. He didn't need to. Life had already delivered its lessons in full. The lawyer called once more to confirm that everything remained secure: the accounts, the property, the trust. The father thanked him politely, then donated a small portion of his savings to a local clinic that provided medicine to the elderly. It felt right. He had once been denied health for the sake of control. Now, his freedom was saving others. Each night, he slept soundly. No fear, no noise, just quiet satisfaction. There were moments, of course, when sadness came, when he remembered the small boy who once held his hand, the laughter of a simpler time, the innocence before greed had entered their lives. But he learned not to run from that sadness. It was part of healing. Pain, he realized, doesn't disappear. It transforms into wisdom if you let it. One afternoon, while watering his small garden, he looked at the sky and thought about how life moves in circles. What you give returns. What you take unfairly is taken back. That was nature's law, older than any written rule. And maybe, he thought, the son would learn too. Maybe one day he would grow from this, understand that love isn't something you control, but something you protect. The father didn't wish for his son's ruin anymore. He wished for his awakening. Months passed quietly. The seasons changed. Flowers bloomed and withered. Rain washed the streets clean, and life carried on. One morning, while reading the newspaper, he came across an article about financial abuse of the elderly. He read it slowly, his hand resting on the table, eyes steady. The article spoke of people who lost everything to their own families, left helpless by betrayal. He folded the paper and smiled faintly. He had been one of them once, but not anymore. His phone rang again that afternoon. This time, it wasn't the lawyer or the bank. It was a number he didn't recognize. When he answered, a voice on the other end spoke softly. It was his son. There was no arrogance in that voice anymore, only exhaustion and a kind of broken calm. He said he was doing better, that he had learned his lesson, that he was working and rebuilding slowly. He didn't ask for money. He only said, "I hope you're doing well." The father said nothing for a moment. Then he replied simply, "I am," and that was enough. When the call ended, the old man sat in his chair for a long time. His eyes didn't tear up. His heart didn't harden. He just sat quietly, feeling something new. Not forgiveness, not regret, but closure. The next morning, he donated more money to the clinic. He told them it was in the name of patience. They smiled and didn't ask questions. By now, his health had improved. His mind was sharper, his days peaceful. The loneliness that once scared him had turned into solitude, gentle, kind, and earned. He spent his evenings watching the sun fall beyond the trees. Every sunset reminded him that endings are not punishments. They are promises, proof that darkness comes only to make room for new light. He didn't see his son again, but he didn't need to. The story had already written itself. The chapter was closed. And though the world would never know what happened behind those quiet walls, the betrayal, the control, the reversal, he didn't need anyone to know. Truth, he realized, doesn't need witnesses. It only needs peace. That night, as he closed his notebook for the last time, he wrote one final line at the bottom of the page. "He took away my medicine and thought I would die. But I lived long enough to teach him that life is a mirror. It always reflects back what you show it." Then he blew out the candle, and the room fell dark. But it was not the darkness of sorrow. It was the darkness of completion. Years have passed since that day, the day everything changed, the day silence became his strongest voice. Time has softened the sharp edges of memory, yet the lessons remain carved deep inside him. He often sits by his window, watching the sun rise slowly over the horizon. Each morning feels like a quiet conversation with life itself, a life that once broke him, then rebuilt him, piece by piece. He doesn't think much about revenge anymore. What once felt like retaliation now feels like balance. The pain he endured, the betrayal he survived, all led him to one simple truth. You can't control how others treat you, but you can control what you do with that pain. When he looks back, he doesn't see just cruelty. He sees awakening. The moment his son cut off his medicine was the moment he learned what dependence costs. He learned that love built on control is not love. It's power disguised as care. And the day he took back his freedom, he wasn't being cruel. He was saving himself. He remembers the long nights when weakness filled his body and silence filled the room. Back then, he used to think that being old meant being helpless. Now he knows that being old only means you've seen enough to recognize truth when it stands before you. He no longer blames his son. Anger had burned him long enough, and anger feeds no one. He's learned that some people grow up without growing wise, that greed blinds faster than age, and that sometimes the only way to teach is through loss. His son learned not through words, but through the weight of his own choices, and maybe that was the only way he ever would. He hopes his son found his own kind of peace. Not wealth, not comfort, but the kind that comes when you finally understand the value of what you've broken. The old man doesn't wish suffering on him anymore. He wishes understanding, because that's what he found when he lost everything. He often writes small reflections now, lessons written not for others, but for himself. He calls them reminders for tomorrow. Some say, peace doesn't come from getting even. It comes from ending the cycle. When they cut your kindness, don't bleed hate, grow distance. To forgive is to remove their shadow from your heart. He has learned that forgiveness is not an event. It's a quiet decision you make again and again until the hurt stops echoing. It's not about letting someone back in. It's about letting yourself go free. He has also learned that independence is not just about money or control. It's about peace of mind. It's waking up and knowing that no one can decide your worth, your breath, your next step. That kind of freedom is priceless. He doesn't miss the noise of family gatherings that were full of tension. He doesn't miss pretending that everything was fine. He doesn't even miss the house he left behind. Because sometimes, leaving what hurts is the only way to return to yourself. The small apartment by the sea has become his temple. The waves outside are his sermons, the sky his prayer book. Every day teaches him something new, not about others, but about himself. He has learned to laugh again, quietly, softly, at simple things. A cat that steals his breakfast, a child who waves at him from the street, a neighbor who insists he looks younger every day. These small things, once unnoticed, now feel like treasures. And yet, beneath that calm, there remains a wisdom carved from fire. He knows how fragile trust is. He knows how power can twist love into something ugly. And he knows that age does not protect you from betrayal, but it does give you the strength to rise above it. Sometimes young people from the town visit him for advice. They ask about family, success, and forgiveness. He never gives long speeches. He just says, "Never give everything to someone who doesn't know the value of enough." Then he smiles, the kind of smile that comes from surviving everything meant to destroy you. He still keeps one photograph, a picture from long ago when his son was a boy sitting on his lap. The smiles in that picture are real, untouched by bitterness. He doesn't hide it away. He keeps it framed on his shelf, not as a reminder of pain, but of what love once was, pure, before pride touched it. He looks at it sometimes and whispers inside his heart, "We were happy once." That was real enough. And that is enough. He doesn't need closure from his son. He doesn't need an apology, or promises, or tears. Life already gave him closure the day he walked into peace and never looked back. Now, each night before bed, he sits on his balcony and watches the horizon fade into twilight. The sound of waves comforts him. The world feels vast again, not as a prison, but as an open road. He breathes deeply, knowing he has lived both love and betrayal, weakness and power, and survived them all. Sometimes he wonders if his story will ever reach others, if people will understand the quiet kind of strength that lives inside survival. But then he smiles and says to himself, "Maybe that's why I tell it, so someone else doesn't wait too long to choose peace." He no longer sees himself as a victim. He sees himself as a witness to how far a heart can bend before it breaks, and how it can still heal after. The world had taken much from him, trust, time, comfort, but it had also given him something greater, clarity. clarity about what truly matters. He no longer measures life in years, but in lessons. And the last lesson was this, that the cruelest people teach the kindest lessons, because they show you exactly who you never want to become. And so, he forgave his son in silence, not for the son's sake, but for his own, because peace cannot share space with bitterness. When people ask him now if he regrets anything, he shakes his head. He says, "No." Every pain was a teacher. Every silence was a friend. Every ending was a door to something kinder. He spends his mornings watering the plants on his balcony. Each leaf, each bloom, feels like proof that life begins again, always. And sometimes, when he looks at the horizon, he thinks about the cycle of life. How sons become fathers, how love becomes loss, and how from loss comes strength. It is all part of the same rhythm. The sea knows it, the wind knows it, and now he does too. He closes his eyes and smiles faintly. He whispers the words he lives by now. He cut off my medicine to control me. I cut off his money to free myself. But what I really did was cut off my pain and set my soul free. Then he leans back in his chair as the sun warms his face. His story is not one of revenge, but of resurrection. The kind of story that doesn't end with anger, but with peace. Because in the end, the greatest revenge is not destruction. It is living so calmly that those who tried to hurt you can no longer touch your peace. That was his freedom. That was his victory. And that was his final truth.